Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sai here today to discuss with you our third and final style of warfare for the French wars, which is artillery. We've looked at cavalry, we've looked at infantry, and now we're on to our artillery video. This, of course, is for the French War, so 1790s into the early 1800s, and it's part of our wider series we have been conducting on that era. So it's very important, if you haven't already, to go back and watch those early videos so you understand what the style of warfare is like in this era, so you're ready when we get onto our land campaign videos, understand how the war is conducted and what problems that the soldiers were facing. With all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So in this video, as we cover our artillery, we're going to be looking at, first off, I'll explain what artillery actually is in this era, how it works. Then we'll look at the types of artillery, the types of cannons that were used, and then of course the ammunition, and finish things off by explaining how they were used in combat, what their roles were, what they actually were used for. So first, we should clarify exactly what we mean when I say artillery, especially in the Napoleonic context of the 1790s and early 1800s. Simply, artillery were these large caliber guns. They had various lengths, various sizes, but they were all designed to fire shells rather than bullets or ball bearings at an enemy. These shells had a strong destructive force capable of killing many soldiers at once. They could destroy forts, they could annihilate whole cities. Now, it's very important to clarify that there are two main types for that. The field artillery is what we see used in pitched battles against infantry and against cavalry, whereas siege or heavy artillery is used to destroy those enemy forts and, of course, commit to bombing campaigns on cities. They provide this high, devastating firepower, which, to be honest, the muskets and sabres truly lack. Yes, we discussed volley fire and the sheer speed and ferocity of a cavalry charge. That's because, in short, they provide this extensive firepower that manned infantry and cavalry simply lack. Much like our cavalry and infantry, the artillery could be split up into different companies. For the artillery, these are called batteries. A battery would contain between 6 to 12 different guns, and a full unit, when all the batteries were together for providing the artillery support for an army, would contain as many as over 200 guns. These were split up even further. For instance, in the British Army, they split them in foot and horse artillery. So foot simply means that the infantry are the ones, it's man-powered. The men are the ones who move it. They pull the guns through terrain. And horse artillery is artillery pulled and pushed with horses. Very important to clarify as well, because of the sheer weight of the guns, you tend to find them carry lighter guns. So we should probably clarify right now that the weights of the guns varied as well. For instance, you can have various pounds, or they can go up to. We have £6 all the way up to £12 you could find. And of course, in a typical battery, for instance, for the British, they would have 5 cannons and 1 howitzer. You'll notice I've also included the image of Napoleon Bonaparte here. This is because Napoleon Bonaparte was a massive proponent of artilleries. He himself had been an artillery captain during the Revolution in France, and so he made a name for himself as a very efficient commander of his own artillery battery, and that's where he rose himself through the ranks, having massive success with them in his invasions in Italy especially. But of course, we're mentioning cannons and howitzers and mortars and different types of artillery. So I think it's very important we clarify what those types of artillery actually are. So we'll start first with our heavy artillery. These are the ones that were used for besieging, they'll be attacking the forts and bombing the cities. These tended to fall under cannons and howitzers. These were the most common guns that were used, and they were 6 to 12 pounders in weight. So what this means is, for instance, let's take a 6 pounder cannon. This meant it could fire rounds that weighed 6 pounds each. These cannons were plentiful, and they fired best when on a flat trajectory with a clear line of sight. They had the capability to shred through lines and lines of infantry and also smash through many fortifications. You tend to find they also fired best when on high ground. Napoleon himself was very famous for making use of high ground when using his artillery in combat. Similarly, the howitzers were used to such the same effect. However, howitzers, as we can see by the diagram, rather than firing straight ahead, they would fire upwards. They would fire high into the air, and then their shots would land on the enemy position. And it had a greater range by doing this, but roughly we find both guns could fire very comfortably to 1100 meters away. After that, their accuracy would start to die down and the force of the shot would lessen as well. So they weren't as effective on longer ranges. But all the same, they were still very effective when used in combat. However, because they are indeed heavy artillery, they take a lot of men to move and maintain. Smaller cases for the smaller pounders, about 8 men would be enough. But when you have a full battery of 12 pounders, you may even need up to 20 men to move them, reposition, resight them, and then of course fire them. And that's very important. You need a very well drilled artillery team who is able to maintain and sight them. So important. If you imagine if the infantry are moving quickly or the cavalry are racing forward, you need you need to be able to recite them quickly to make best use of them in combat. So that's our heavy artillery, but what about our light artillery? So light artillery tended to be mortars. These were smaller guns weighing around 1500 kilogram, and they could be manned quite comfortably by a 4-man team, because they're lighter, they're easier to maintain. They were very effective in combat, used to disrupt enemy positions, and also could be moved quicker as well, which made them very good for repositioning and able to adapt in the midst of battle how the enemy was reacting and maneuvering. You also had a lesser used type of light artillery, which were rockets. They were a new weapon. They were devised in 1806. The first ones were the Congreve rockets, and they had some promise. They could fire further than any other type of artillery before them. Up to 2,800 meters away was a very strong record for them. However, they had many problems. I mean, we have to understand, unlike rockets today, this was in the primitive age of their use. They were still being field tested. They had problems with transport. The fuses tended to wear out, depending on the temperature. And above all, the accuracy was really unreliable. You couldn't really fire very proficiently. And so rockets don't really see much use in this Napoleonic era. But all the same, it's worth being aware of them against a new type of warfare weapon, and indeed they do debut in some battles in the Peninsula and elsewhere in the wars. So there are 4 main types of artillery. But what is the ammunition that is actually fired within them? Well, we have 3 variations. The variations are round, canister, and shrapnel. There are other ones. There are carcass ones, for example. But for the sake of our series, the main 3 will do. So round shots were these small iron balls, and they were very good. They were very good. They were much better than the typical common shot that was used. These could fire very well over a long range. They consist of small iron balls, and they could smash through the enemy infantry without trouble. It was very common for about 15 lines of enemy infantry to be blasted away and absolutely decimated, and barriers up to 1100 meters away, fences, this kind of thing, could easily be decimated over 1100 meters away. They also could be used to effectively fire at enemy command posts, and of course, when enemies were moving in their columns, they were especially vulnerable to this artillery fire, so they could rip through dozens of them in a line. However, the only issue with this is that the batteries required a constant field of vision to fire accurately into. So if you were firing over a longer distance, your black powder would not be as explosive, and therefore you would lose your vision. You imagine continuously firing these, smoke's going to build up, and you're going to lose vision, it's going to cloud around your position. So another type of shot was developed for when the enemy is within close range, and this is where the canister and grape shot it comes into being. Now these were small iron balls that were packed tightly into a canister, or typically a cylinder, hence their name. They also could be put into a bag or a cloth. This type of grape shot was very effective because it would scatter widely to cover an area. It was only effective at close range, about 200 meters or so, and then it was scattered too far to be of much effect. But it worked extremely well within this distance. It could also shred woodlands that enemy infantry may be hiding or maneuvering in. So it was very effective in these scenarios. And the third type we need to be aware of is shrapnel. Now, this was the primary shot type, which functioned very similar to canister shot, but it had been improved to be much more effective over 1,000 meters. It had a much thicker casing, and rather than just exploding on impact, it instead would have a timer before it would explode and scatter. So in theory, this was really good because you could have the same kind of shredding effect that grape shot could do, but you could have it spread over a longer distance. However, much like rockets, the timers weren't really fully developed yet, and so they were very inconsistent. Sometimes they would land and take ages to go off, sometimes not at all. So they did have mixed success in combat, but generally these are the types of ammunitions that were used: round, canister, and shrapnel. But now it's very important to understand how exactly were they used in combat? And this takes us to our two main uses in combat. First is battery fire, and the next is counter battery fire. So battery fire was very, very effective. This was used among the field artillery. It was very good because it was intending to batter the infantry or cavalry positions. They would fire it from a distance, and the aim was to really weaken them, to make them much more vulnerable, to destroy their line formation, ready for your own infantry or cavalry charge. Napoleon was a strong proponent of what he called the Grand Battery. So he would gather some of his artillery together and they would focus on a certain point, typically the center, and they would smash hard into that position, intending to really severely weaken it so it would be really vulnerable to his cavalry charges. As we covered in my cavalry video, the best type of cavalry charges were ones that were combined with artillery. And so Napoleon was a big proponent of that. Use the artillery to weaken the infantry lines so the cavalry can have an easier time breaking them down. However, battery fire could also be used for containment as well. You can actually fire on the flanks either side of an enemy position to keep them there, to stop them spreading too wide, and actually keep them enclosed in a small space. This kind of concentration of force was very effective for trapping an enemy and restricting their ability to move, which made them more predictable and prevented the enemy from adapting to situations on the ground. And above all else, it favoured to be used on high ground. You wanted that big field of vision to fire into. Napoleon was a big fan of that. He made great use of it in war. However, as the wars went on, Arthur Wellesley, or the Duke of Wellington, who we'll be talking about a lot in our Peninsular War and our land series coming up, he learned to counter artillery by using something called a reverse slope defense. We'll say more on this in our coming videos, but it's where he'd have a hill terrain and he would position his men behind the hill rather than be on top and have that full field of vision. He would trust his men to be behind the hill to use that land terrain as a natural barrier, as that great defence against the artillery's battery. This proved to great effect in his Peninsular campaigns and perhaps most famously at Waterloo. But we'll say more on that in our series going forward. The second type of use in combat was the opposite. It was counter battery fire. So rather than aiming at cavalry or infantry, you would instead choose to aim at the enemy's own artillery batteries. This one, we have to admit, was not as popular. So counter battery fire differed from battery is that by firing at the artillery, you aim to disrupt their own use. If you could stop the artillery yourself, then therefore you could do two things. You could protect your infantry and cavalry from fire, and also rob your enemy of an entire third of its fighting force. However, the difficulty of this is the positioning of artillery tended to be the furthest point back during the combat. And so in a pitched battle, it was very difficult. When we just had 1,000 meters or so, the accuracy of artillery starts to struggle. And so because the artillery is so far away, you tend to be struggling to fire accurately into the enemy. Napoleon himself, as a great fan of artillery, outright dismissed this method. He saw it as a vital waste of ammunition, and so it wasn't really massively popular and therefore was rarely used, especially used to any sort of noteworthy effect. However, counter-battery fire could be used in different manners. For instance, Wellington preferred to use artillery for scorched earth. He would tactically retreat from a position and then use the artillery to destroy the land that he just occupied, if nothing more than to rob the French of supplies in the area that they were trying to use, as well as slowing down any advance they were going to make. He used this quite famously in the Peninsular War at the lines of Torres Vedras. And then the intention was then to counter-attack once the enemy was exposed and overstretched. And that's what you have to understand here. Artillery has two main uses. It can be used offensively, but it can be used defensively as well. And so, because of that, the strength of an artillery battery really depended on how it was used, and of course, when it was used in combat to greatest effect. Its greatest means was when, of course, the lines of sight were at their best, when you had a great field of vision and a clear line of infantry to fire into. But if someone could use retreat tactics, if you could use natural terrain like a reverse slope defense, or even use your own artillery batteries to counter the fire of the enemy, then maybe artillery's effectiveness really depended on how they were used in the battle rather than just them the outright winner of a war in its own right. French Emperor Napoleon had made his career from taking the high ground and barraging enemy lines with artillery, while Wellington was going to make his name by using hills and reverse slope defences to protect his men against those barrages. And there we are, that finishes our overview of how artillery has been used in the Napoleonic Wars. There is much more to say. As always, do check out my further reading in the description box below if you want to expand your knowledge on how they're used in combat a bit further. But now we're going to be going forward in our following videos into those actual land battles themselves, how they're used, and of course, I think it's good to be aware of how they combine together the infantry, the cavalry, and artillery. These are parts of Napoleonic War that we have to be keenly aware of as we explore our battles, especially in the Peninsular War and at Waterloo. As always, make sure you're like, commenting, and subscribing to my videos. I'll be aiming to post more content as our term goes on. I do hope you're finding it useful and effective as always, and do check out my previous videos if you need to catch up on that, and of course the naval war that we've already covered as well. With all that said, this has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.